If you've got big dreams and bad jeans, you are in the right place. These t-shirts and other Bromley merch are available at barbellapparel.com, link below. And speaking of, big goals require a big foundation, and there is no foundation more essential to big lifts or an aesthetic physique than a large, muscular, imposing back. A big back is a driver of big pulls. It supports big presses, and it's a visual signal to others that your spine is strong where theirs is weak. So let's start with figuring out what the hell an upper back day is anyways. To most people, this just looks like somebody took a comforter and threw it over a trash heap. So let's give a boost to our problem solving and hopefully improve our approach to getting a big upper back by picking apart the anatomy, starting with the muscle that everybody associates with upper back work, the lats. These are arguably the biggest muscles of the back. They stand out the most, they grow the quickest. The lats cover the real estate on your back below the plane of your armpit, and they attach to your upper arm to bring it down into the side. So if your arm is out to the front and you bring it down, we call that extension. If your arm is out to the side and you bring it down, we call that adduction. Now that's crucial because you get a lot of analytical power with a whole host of complex exercises based on your ability to distinguish if there is more extension or more adduction. If your arm is coming down to the side, that isolates the lats, where if it's coming down from the front, there's going to be a lot more involvement from the other muscles of the upper back. And since these muscles designate if you're training for, quote, width or thickness, this is an important distinction. But it's also kind of cool to know that any rowing movement is going to hit the lats in some capacity, and that gives even chubby strongmen the illusion of a V-taper. Now next up we have the traps, which sit on top of the lats and the rest of your upper back musculature, and these cover a lot of real estate in the upper back area. The role of the traps is to move and support the neck and the scapula, moving your shoulder blades around, elevating your shoulder girdle. This is the job of the traps. Most people associate traps with the part that pops up above your shoulders that makes it look like your neck disappeared, and they will often not associate it with upper back work. But that should change because most upper back work you do is going to at least indirectly hit the traps, and developing the mid and lower traps is super essential for what we call thickness, making it look like there's more overall meat on your upper back. You're going to hit this part of your traps with other rowing movements that feature a flared elbow position, often where you're pulling high into the chest. That's also going to hit your rhomboids as well, but we don't really need to distinguish because most movements that hit the traps are also going to hit the rhomboids. Now we've talked about width and thickness, but the upper traps are what give your back height. That's something people don't often talk about, but there's nothing that says jacked like being able to see somebody's back from the front. This is important for supporting heavy ass weights in your hands, but it's also a powerful visual signal to other people. It is a very intuitive reaction people have to big traps. They just make people look scarier. And if you don't believe me, here's a picture of Goldberg without his traps. Now deep below the traps, below the lats, below the rhomboids, we have the spinal erectors. Now most people associate the erectors with the low back because that's where they feel it, but these suckers run all the way up like two giant loaves of French bread. And when you do a good enough job of pumping them up by doing movements that extend and move your spine, it's going to add a ton of thickness. In an old video, C.T. Fletcher referred to Mike Rashid's chest as a butt chest because it looked like a butt when it was pumped up. Well, big erectors are how you get a butt back. I'll leave it up to you to decide if that's something you actually want to chase. Now we have enough to go into the tier list. Now instead of the typical scattershot of random exercises in no particular order, we're going to categorize movements by types so we can see trends more easily. I'm going to give a grade to each category as a whole, but also to the individual exercises within that category. In order of most to least fatiguing, the categories are deadlifts, strongman movements, rows, machine work, body weight work, and cable or isolation movements. The grade is going to be based primarily on how much each exercise does to potentially grow a big, strong, imposing upper back without much of anything else. So it's important to know that if something gets a lower grade, it doesn't mean that it's not a useful exercise or that you should avoid it or that it's going to kill gains. It's just that it probably is incomplete and needs to be paired with other exercises in order to maximize the muscularity of your back. I'm only giving good exercises, and the assumption is that all of them cause growth and can be progressed to grow a big set of bat wings. I'm not going to waste time with renegade rows or Joel Seedman stability ball pulls just so I have something to put in the F tier. So SNA tier movements are both sufficient by themselves to grow a back, and they're also necessary, and they also usually have some unique feature that you're not going to get with another exercise. B and C tier movements are still really good. They're probably a bit more focused and isolated, which might make them S tier if that's what you're trying to do. But for general growth, they're probably going to lack some useful feature that a higher tier lift has, and they're probably going to need to be paired with other exercises. D tier is today's F tier. These are movements that don't do a lot by themselves. They're usually unnecessarily technical or gimmicky, and they're really overblown. People usually like them because it feels like they're doing something really surgical and deliberate, but for most people, it's a distraction. It's like trying to carve an ice block with a toothpick when you need a chisel. And if at the end of this you want to know what to do with these exercises, hit the link below and grab the free PDF outlining 5 different programming options for plugging these exercises into your current routine. First category up, we have deadlifts. Now, deadlifts aren't going to maximize muscle on your back, but they will obviously build muscle over time. Nobody ever built a bigger deadlift and had a smaller back as a result. That's just not a thing. The fact of holding a loaded barbell in your hands in a hinge bent over position means that the lats, the traps, the rhomboids, and of course the erectors are all straining like their life depends on it to keep your back from folding like a cheap lawn chair. And as you progress weight over time, those muscles adapt by getting bigger. RDLs and stiff leg deadlifts do this the best. These are the God tier developmental movements for deadlift type patterns. And it's the reason that they're such a common accessory staple for building a big deadlift in the first place. You get more range of motion, more tempo, more control. And anybody who's taken RDLs into the weeds in later reps knows the fire you get in your armpits from trying to pull the bar back. There's that shoulder extension movement we were talking about. As a general rule, more disadvantaged movements are better developmental movements, and that's exactly what RDLs and stiff leg deadlifts do, so I give these an A tier. Going to the floor, we are now in a little bit more of an optimized position. The trade-off is that the weight is going to be a lot heavier, even though we're not so disadvantaged. This is also going to be the case for elevated deadlifts or trap bar deadlifts. You are in a more upright position, but the amount of sheer weight that you handle in these optimized positions provide a huge stimulus for the upper back. And people that spam these movements usually see a unique type of development in their upper back that you're not going to get with just rowing type movements. And of course, the erector development is going to add an extra dimension that just simple dumbbell or cable work can't. So for the optimized positioning, I give deadlifts from the floor and elevated deadlifts a B tier listing. And to the surprise of probably nobody watching this video, sumo deadlifts get a D tier rating. Is this my bias? Maybe, but sumo deadlifts have you in the most upright position possible. The goal is to optimize you as much as possible by reducing strain on that musculature, and that by definition makes it a worse developmental movement. Doing a sumo deadlift to get a bigger upper back, it's like doing a sumo deadlift to get better at running a mile. So all in all, deadlifts get a B tier rating. Most of them are going to do a lot to build the foundation for a big upper back, and the erector development is going to add an element of thickness you can't get anywhere else. So pairing any basic deadlift movement with other rowing movements is a guaranteed ticket to getting a barn door back. Next up, we have strongman movements. Now, whatever deadlifts do for your upper back, strongman movements do that plus more, and they're also easier to recover from. You can do strongman movements regularly throughout the week, carries, farmer walks, yokes, and you're not going to have that much of a problem as if you were trying to do heavy deadlifts 2 or 3 times a week. The real magic in strongman movements is the extra work the upper back has to do with awkward objects that are wider and thicker, that require a lot more effort to control, and with the moving of the actual spine. Ideally with deadlift movements, you're keeping your spine braced, but with loads and carries, the spine is flexing and extending, and the erectors just get a huge growth effect out of that. The front carries are a great exercise, whether you're doing a Conan's wheel or a sandbag carry, or if you're going up to Iceland to go full Sturker by carrying the actual Husafell stone around the goat pen. Getting a weight in front of you, bear hugging it, pulling it in, keeping it tight while your legs do the heavy lifting to propel you around a long distance. That's a great stimulus for the upper back. It's also fun and life affirming and increases conditioning and basic utility. There are so many reasons to do this, but as just a stimulus for the upper back, we have to grade it on the fact that it's an isometric only movement. Once you get it into position, there's no moving. Everything exists just to support your posture and keep you in position while your feet do the work. So for that reason, I have to give front carries a C. They're still great when paired with a bunch of other stuff, but by themselves, they're limited. Now, if we go to a loading movement, we kick everything up a notch because we're selecting for the elements that do the most to grow your upper back. Loading refers to getting something from the ground into your lap, re-gripping it, and then pulling it in tight as you extend the hips, roll your spine into extension, stand up, and pop it onto the shelf or over the bar, and you repeat. But the local fatigue you feel in the upper back from doing loads for reps is unlike anything you're going to find in a gym. We used to finish our strongman days by doing double-digit stone loads over a bar, and I'm telling you, when you can do a bodyweight stone load for 10 reps inside of a minute, you're going to have an upper back that looks like it was made out of the same material. Loading is S tier all the way. It does a ton by itself. The development is very unique, and there's just no way to get good at it without your entire physique transforming. Now, past that, we have yoke and farmers. Yoke is going to go to the bottom of the list. Yoke is a C tier lift because you're not supporting the weight with your hands. You are supporting the weight on your upper back. The upper back does have to work, but people like to go heavy. You find that when you're doing shorter yoke runs, the only thing you're working is the cartilage in your ankles, knees, and hips. It's a good way to make yourself shorter, and they're very hard to recover from. There's a thing called yoke flu from people that push it too hard. If you are going to use it for upper back work, you're going to want to go long, but most people don't have the open real estate that Tom Havlin does, where you can go like 200 yards without setting it down, just because of how cumbersome it is to set up and how little it's going to do to grow your upper back. Yokes go into the C tier. Farmers, on the other hand, are a different animal. You're still upright and carrying, but you're holding the weight in your arms, which gives a much more direct stimulus to the lats and to the traps. Similarly, you're going to want to go long, and I recommend people strapping in to take their grip out of it. If you're not strapping in, it's a grip exercise. If you are strapped in, you might stand a chance of getting some stimulus in your upper back. Farmers go into the A tier. Long, hard farmer walks are great. They do a lot by themselves. Again, it's that unique development you can't get with regular gym lifts, but there's just not a lot of people that are going to commit to dealing with the suck of those long, endless farmer walk runs. And that's unfortunate because we'd have more men out in the world if they were doing that. So strongman events are A tier. Unique development, relatively easy to recover from. They do a lot on their own and they're just fun as shit. Now we're going into the classical gym lifts, the rowing movements we associate with upper back development, starting with free weight rowing movements. Starting at the top with cheat rows. Cheating variations are just absolutely fantastic for the right individual. We can look at something like a Yates row as a kind of a cheat row because it's very upright. It's optimized to limit the range of motion. Bodybuilders say they do this to hit their lower lats. Really, they do it because it allows them to handle a lot more weight, and it's less fun to do a row when you're bent way the hell over. I think Yates rows are a perfectly fine exercise, but understand that if it's done because it targets the lower lat, that means it's probably not doing as much for the width of the lats, which is where most people want to see the size and strength. That's what's going to transform your physique, and it's what's going to allow you to perform better. These type of movements are also easy to muck up, so I tend to grade them down a little bit. I give a Yates row a B. It's not going to do quite as much for your overall back development as a standard, more pitched over row. Now, going into something like a power row, these I like to think of as S tier. I romanticize power rows because we're back into like strongman territory. You're getting movement in the hips and the spine. The erectors have to work harder to stabilize. The fatigue that people associate with rows that make them want to avoid them in favor of chest supported stuff, that's oftentimes a feature, not a bug. And I think that's the case with power rows. That's part of the benefit is that you're getting that erector development. You're having to stabilize these huge weights, but also the upper back is getting stretched under these immense loads. And that's a huge developmental stimulus. The strength curve of the upper back is a little bit weird because when you start at the bottom, that's actually the most advantaged position. And it's the opposite when you're benching, squatting, deadlifting. Usually the bottom sucks, the top is optimized. In rows, the top is the hardest part. So using a bit of body English can help you smooth out the strength curve so there's more even effort being applied through each inch of the range of motion. But also it just requires more aggression. You're going heavier, you're exposing yourself to more loads. Ideally, these are S tier, but you have to know how to hit into them. This isn't a hump the bar and then throw yourself on top of it so you can say that it touched your stomach. A good power row is using momentum to bleed into a full controlled rowing movement. Yes, it's aggressive and violent, but it's also deliberately done, and that requires experience and a bit of finesse. It should go off like a push press more than anything. The problem is most everybody does these in a really stupid, sloppy fashion. So we can run the gamut from S tier all the way down to F- tier. And that's really going to depend on you and your commitment to execution. These have to come on the back end of years of strict rowing. You have to know what a real row feels like before you get something out of a power row. Now that brings us to a croc row. Croc rows are S tier all the way. Even if you're screwing them up and getting stupid with them, being off-centered with the weight, the anti-rotation of having to fight against a weight pulling off to the side is such a good like basic core exercise. Your erectors do have to work a ton. And because your whole body is working to support one arm instead of weight for both arms, you can overload the shit out of it. So that stretch position is getting absolutely obliterated. And then heaving your whole body, again, smoothing out the strength curve, getting a bit of follow through. I do recommend going not quite as sloppy as Matt Kroc himself, but anybody who is a psychopath enough to go into the 20, 30, 40 rep range with sufficient amounts of effort and then progress them forward week in, week out to where they're using 10, 20, 30% more than they would be using on a regular set of rows, they're going to see just absolutely monumental upper back growth from this. As we go into more standard strict type rows, we're eliminating the sway, the body English that helps us through the top. So we're going to lose a little bit of something because we're always fighting against that top range where the strength curve is working against us the most. Upper back work with free weights is almost like doing other lifts against bands. It gets harder as you get closer to the top. Now that's okay because strict and deep bent over barbell rows teach you to start from the stretch and build up a ton of momentum in order to get the bar going. So if you're doing that with just your arms, the lats have to work very, very hard in the stretch position, and that is in and of itself a good hypertrophic stimulus. Also being bent over, the elbows are going to be out to the side more, pulling to your mid chest. You're going to get a lot of that mid trap and rhomboid development that we associate with thickness of the upper back. And anytime you're bent over standing on your own 2 feet, the erectors are going to get a benefit as well. So all of the muscles having to work and coordinate around that little bit of instability, along with the capacity of bent barbell rows to widen your lats out and thicken the middle part of your back. This is just an S tier exercise all the way. It's the cornerstone for all of the other rows that you're going to do. It's one of a few exercises you can plug in and progress like a strength movement, like you would your bench or your squat. And every 10, 20, 30 pounds you add on to your numbers is going to translate to a substantial change in your physique. It really is that simple. When you're starting out, get really, really good at strict deep barbell rows. And then by the time you move on to the more aggressive cheating type stuff, you're just going to be better off for it. Beyond that, we have upright rows. People normally associate this with a trap movement, not necessarily an upper back movement, but I would say they are wrong because whatever rowing does for your lats, for the real estate below your armpit, upright rows are going to do for everything above the armpit. Your upper traps are going to get hit, your rear delts, your rhomboids, your mid traps. So we're dealing with the thickness, we're dealing with that shelf that sits on top of your shoulders where it looks like you have that cowboy collar. And that is every bit as integral to a big, strong upper back is actually having wide lats. Upright rows are also fun. It's a validating exercise to just grab a barbell and pull it up to mid chest. It's a simple execution. This is another one you can progress like a strength movement, and it does a lot. It does the job of multiple movements, and the development you get from it, I'm also going to say is pretty unique. I'm going to give these an A tier rating. They're amazing for what they do. Obviously, you're not going to get big or thick lats doing upright rows, but for the part that it hits very well, and it should be an integral part of anybody's upper back routine. Now we go to free T-bar rows. I'm not really such a fan of these because the plates get in the way, you can't get the full contraction, and balancing it's kind of weird where once you get to weight that's somewhat challenging, you find yourself having to like lean back so you don't fall forward. It's just a very awkward movement. Now, one thing the T-bar does, like we talked about, is it smooths out the strength curve because as the bar is coming up, it moves more horizontally than vertically. So it's a bit easier at the top, which means you get more even effort through the whole rep. That's very good. With a close grip handle, you also get a really good stretch at the bottom. And that stretch is a great hypertrophic stimulus. And the positioning with the elbows flared, pulling mid-chest, hits most of your back. Lats, rhomboids, traps, even the rear delts and such get hit. So T-bars have the potential to be a really good exercise. I just really don't like how cumbersome they are, and I don't like how the balance is kind of wonky. In my opinion, you're going to get a lot more out of using a chest-supported row where you can focus on the back more and save the freestanding movements for ones where you're more stable and it's easier to support the weight. I give T-bar rows a solid B tier. I think they do a lot on their own, but it's got some things working against it. And then lastly, on the strict list, we have strict dumbbell rows. Just like strict barbell rows, this should be a staple introductory movement. However, once you get sufficiently strong, I think really strict dumbbell rows will sell you short a bit. I think you're always going to be justified as your strength increases, you get more advanced, starting to incorporate more body English on some of these free weight movements, not necessarily all of them. But nobody with a really big upper back is doing super duper strict freestanding dumbbell rows. That's not really a thing because it takes so much effort to stabilize that position that you're not really going to be able to focus on the really big, strong musculature of your upper back. So this is a good introductory exercise. I give strict dumbbell rows a solid B. Elbow in tight, you're going to hit more of your lats, elbow flared, more rhomboids, mid traps, but use it as a stepping stone. If you're not doing really strict one-arm dumbbell rows with like the 80s for sets of 8 or 10, you're probably not quite to the point where you need to be throwing on weight and doing a bunch of crazy croc rows. And the last subcategory here, we have the strictest of strict movements, and those are the chest supported rows. This is strict squared. Think of a seal row where your chest is flat against a bench, but you're still using a free weight barbell or dumbbell. I think seal rows are great for isolating the upper back by not having to stabilize. Now you can really maximize force production and fatigue in the main mover. So it's going to put more emphasis there, and it's going to take emphasis away from, again, the erectors. If you are already doing a lot of movements that heavily tax the erectors, you might be justified in this movement. I tend to think this is a little bit the worst of both worlds because you have the stability of a machine, but you don't have the strength curve smoothed out. You're still using a free weight machine where it's harder as you get to your chest. I think that's a little bit of a shortcoming. There's no doubt anybody who spams seal rows is probably going to grow their upper back just fine, but I give them a B tier rating. If you're going to use free weight, I say get the free weight experience, but that's just my bias. Then we have chest supported T-bar rows. Now these solve the problem that the freestanding T-bar rows had, where you're not dealing with balance. You get the benefit of the deep stretch, you have multiple grip options you can go with, and the bar gets easier to pull as you get closer to the chest, which means you can get a nice hard full contraction and your muscles are being comparably stimulated at each inch of the entire range of motion. It's not lopsided where it's like really hard at the top and really easy at the bottom. You have a nice smooth strength curve and that's great. T-bars are a solid go-to for anybody who's trying to supplement their strongman or deadlift work with just some targeted upper back work that's not going to put them more into a recovery debt. So overall, I give free weight barbell rowing movements S tier. Most of them can stand alone. You can train them by themselves, and if you progress them, they're gonna give you just about everything you need for a big ass barn door back. Some of them have some shortcomings, but it's all dependent on your goals. But the focus should be on freestanding barbell rows, eventually to things like power rows with a little bit more sway, and croc rows, where you're really exploiting the overload to get your upper back to a different universe. When done correctly, the cheating variations of these movements just cannot be replicated with simple machine work or strict rowing movements. The next category are machine rows. These are almost all done on some type of cam machine to smooth out the strength curve, and that is a big developmental bonus. And they're also supported, so you're not working your erectors, you're not building up extra fatigue. Makes it super easy to throw in at the end of the workout. There's a big benefit to machine rows apart from how they actually stimulate back growth. Think of your normal selectorized or plate loaded machine row, something like a hammer strength, and you're usually going to have 3 different pull positions, a low, a mid, or a high pull position. The low position is going to involve more of the mid traps and rhomboids, so again, more of a quote unquote thickness exercise, and a bit less lat overall. Now, if you're pulling with your elbow out wide, you're going to emphasize that trap and rhomboid development. But if you keep your elbow in tight to the side, this is where bodybuilders claim to be targeting their lower lat. So a bit more lat work there. But again, remember, if you're targeting your lower lat, that means you're not necessarily targeting the overall thickness of your lat. To do that, you're going to want to go to a higher position. A mid pull is going to be more evened out. More of your upper back is going to be hit. Again, with tucked elbows hitting more of your lats and flared elbows hitting more of the entire thickness of the center part of your back around your traps. And the higher position is going to emphasize lats the most. Now, I have a preference for low rows because a lot of people have deficiencies in their mid and upper traps. And it's really easy when you spam certain rowing movements to get a little bit lat heavy. So I think it's important to have movements like this that round you out. But for overall development, you have to go with the movement that just does the most at once. I give the mid-level pull, something like a hammer strength iso row, an S tier. The fact that you're stable, that there's a smoothed out strength curve, and the positioning hits most of the musculature of your upper back, it just does so many things well, and it's super easy to wedge into your programming no matter what you do. If you have just a run-of-the-mill barbell linear progression and you just add these in twice a week, you're doing most of the job of getting a big upper back developed. S tier all the way. The higher or lower positions are a bit more targeted. They're good for either variation for the sake of it or because you want to focus either more on your lats or more on your mid or upper back. Nobody's going to shrink from doing these movements, that's for sure. I still give them a B rating. They're just not going to do quite as much as the iso row is by itself. Now we go to pull down movements. So remember, higher pulling positions is going to be a lot more lats. The greatest amount of lat isolation you're going to get is when your elbows are flared and you're engaging in adduction. So the arm is coming down to the side. That's something like a behind the neck, wide grip lat pull down. That is great for smoking the lats, and you're going to feel that burn right in your armpit when you do that. However, that comes at the cost of the other muscles that do contribute to the thickness. So it is a lot more limited. That's a good finesse movement I like to throw at the end of a workout that's built around more heavier compound barbell movements. Now, as the bar moves in front of you, you're going to get a bit more mid-trap involvement. So a little more thickness is going to be on the menu. And then if you're in a narrow grip with a V handle, you're going to get a lot more lat stretch. So there's a bonus there. So I'm inclined to give a B tier rating to a narrow grip pull down from the front. This is going to be very similar to a high pull hammer strength row. And as we go to the other variations, again, these are more targeted, but that also means they do less overall. So I give a C tier to lat pull downs from the front with a regular grip or behind the neck. Great at the end of the workout, just limited by themselves. The cable row is going to be very similar to a hammer strength iso row, but there's a couple different features that, in my opinion, make it a little less productive. There's no chest supported feature, so that makes it a little less efficient for squeezing every bit of force production out of the muscles of the upper back. It also doesn't have a smoothed out strength curve. They're usually based around simple pulley systems, so it's very linear. You still have the problem of the weight getting much, much harder as you pull closer and closer to your body. Now, if you go with a wide grip cable row, elbows flared, pulling up to the mid chest or to the top of the abdomen, you are going to get just a ton of rhomboid, mid trap, and rear delt stimulation in addition to a hearty amount of lat growth. You're not going to get quite as much of a stretch in the lats, but the trade-off is that the lats are in a disadvantaged position, so they have to work harder at the start. With a narrow position, you're going to get a much greater stretch. And if you lean into it, you can really feel those suckers open up, and that can be a really good hypertrophic stimulus. You're also a bit stronger in a narrow position because you can make use of your biceps. It does feel, though, that it's hard to really get your shoulder blades back in a narrow position. Usually people default to pulling low to their belly button, elbows down, and again, that's a lot more lats, taking a lot of the traps and rhomboids out of the equation. I don't see one as being overall better than the other. I think the trade-offs are minimal. These are good to recognize to include variation for the sake of it, or if you have a specific problem you're wanting to solve. But I give cable rows a solid A rating. Really just the lack of a modified strength curve is what knocks this down from where the machine iso row would be. So overall, I give machine rows A tier. They're versatile. You can do a lot of surgical work to round out weak areas in your upper back. And a few of these options, if you hold them as your main lift for a long period of time, are going to go a long way to filling out your upper back. The only downside is you're not going to get as much of the nasty, dense thickness that you get from developing the erectors and filling out those deep muscles that sit underneath the lats. Now, the body weight category. There is a cult of body weight exercise aficionados that romanticize anything done with your body weight. I think body weight stuff is great. There's no reason you can't make it work for you, especially if there's nothing else around. But if you have other options, body weight stuff has some limitations that I think make them probably the worst options on this list. Take pull-ups and chin-ups, for example. Now, we can pick these apart the exact same way we would the pull-downs with the wider versus closer grip or the changes in hand position. The same rules are going to apply. However, with your body hanging from a bar, you're going to be swinging a bit as you get fatigued. It's a more awkward, unbalanced position, and also most people struggle to actually do their body weight. So if you're starting out with not a very strong upper back, if you can't really do that many pull-ups consecutively, progressing it to where it can be regular working sets for you is a bit of a challenge. It's much harder to scale, even if you do have bands or if you have a weight belt, so you can scale up weight incrementally. Most of the people who love pull-ups are people who have just been doing them forever and they got really good at them. But the question is, what do you do in order to get to that point where you're really good at them? So I give pull-ups a C tier. Even if you have some type of machine support that provides a counterweight, I don't see the benefit beyond what you would get out of doing a pull down or some type of high position machine row. And anybody who spent time getting pretty strong at bent rows has found that if they go over to a pull-up bar, suddenly they're able to do a fair amount of pull-ups. So I like to default to the simpler methods that do the same amount of work but are easier. There's less obstacles in your way. An inverted row is a way that some people will scale into a pull-up. Now this is one I've seen romanticized by people. I've even heard health benefits assigned to this. The benefit of an inverted row is one, that it's manageable. Most people can handle their weight or set up in a position where they can handle their own weight. But the emphasis is getting your chest to the bar, which brings the shoulder blades together. You get a lot of active movement in the scapula, and it's good for developing strength around that area. However, we've already demonstrated we can do that with just about every exercise here. It just has to be a point of focus, something that you're aware of. Inverted rows are super awkward to set up. They are very unstable and they're impossible to load even when you have a partner there stacking plates. They're not comfortable, they're not convenient. I think the greatest use case for an inverted row is on something like a body weight circuit where the focus is more on conditioning than anything else. But this is not going to be the ticket to a giant muscular impressive upper back. So I'm going to give pull-ups and chin-ups a C tier rating, inverted rows drop to D, and body weight rowing movements overall I'm going to give C tier. That's not to say that you parkour or calisthenic nut jobs can't get an impressive physique from just doing these movements, but it is to say that the barriers that keep people from getting good at these are easily solved with other generic gym lifts. Now, the last group here is isolation. We're talking about moving at one joint. Everything so far has been either an isometric or it's been an actual rowing type movement where you're moving at the shoulder and the elbow. Isolation movements, we're just moving at the shoulder joint. So to start off with the lats, we talked about extension, bringing the arm down to the side from the front, or adduction, bringing it down to the side from the side. And anytime you strap resistance to your arm and go through that movement, that is a great way to isolate your lat. The obvious one that you can do is with a straight arm pull down, where you're standing in front of a lat pull down machine, keeping your elbows locked and just pulling the weight down in front. You will absolutely feel your lats start to blow up as you cycle through reps. And this is really good for cueing keeping the bar back when you do things like deadlifts. It's what makes the RDL so difficult when you start to get fatigued. Now, this is a good movement pattern, but unfortunately, it's really hard to get a big stimulus out of it because by the time you're really straining, usually the weight is sufficient that you're starting to pull your body up. So you might need to have somebody hold you down. Also, the strength curve is really wonky if you're using a lat pull down machine because it gets kind of hard around the mid range. But by the time you start bringing the bar back against your thighs or hips, it gets really easy. Like all the tension gets taken out. And that's actually where you want to emphasize the squeeze. Now, we can solve these problems by going to a dumbbell pullover, which is romanticized as one of the great old school movements that people forgot about. Now, I think dumbbell pullovers have a lot to offer, but we're back to the strength curve being a problem. You get a monster stretch when you're letting that dumbbell come back over your head, just absolutely huge. And that is great for shoulder health, for opening you up, keeping mobility, and also getting a really good growth stimulus in the lats at that position. And you are absolutely isolating the lats in a way you can't really mimic with anything else. However, just like with dumbbell flies, once you get past the midway point, all the tension is removed and you're moving the weight more horizontally than vertically, so it stops being difficult. That's the point where you want a lot of lat engagement. So I give the straight arm pull down a D. It's not going to do a lot by itself. It's kind of awkward. I give the dumbbell pullover a C, a much better exercise, but with its limitations. Now, those of you that have access to a machine pullover, like the one Arthur Jones gets credit for inventing, this is a solid A tier movement because it solves all of those problems. People have called this the squat for the upper back. I don't know about all that, but you are isolating the lats. You are fully supported. You're not dealing with any instability. You're not even dealing with bicep fatigue because you've taken the elbow movement out of it. And you are just engaged in pure shoulder extension and the strength curve is smoothed out via the cam that allows every inch of the movement to be comparably difficult, so you don't get this lopsided movement pattern. There's an entire subculture dedicated to finding these machines because they are so rare and they're in such high demand. Now, obviously, they're not going to hit the overall thickness of your back like a lot of the rowing variations will. They take your erectors completely out of it. They're not designed to really hit the traps or rhomboids seriously, but it does have a rib expanding effect, which is the main reason a lot of people did pullovers back in the day, to try and get the ribs broader to create a bigger frame to hold more muscle. So machine pullovers do a lot. And if you have access to one, I recommend you rotate that in as part of your movement. Also super easy to wedge in on any day. So let's say you develop the big, thick, juicy lats that look like they need to be carved up for Thanksgiving dinner. Now you need that cowboy collar to sit on top of it. Those are the traps, rear delts, rhomboids, and anything that mimics a horizontal rowing movement where the weight is being moved towards your face is going to hit those muscles. So we can look at rear pec deck flies, bent dumbbell raises, face pulls, all as being effective at developing those muscles. Now, I really like these for a health standpoint. We don't do enough external rotation, and we sure don't do enough rhomboid or rear delt isolation specifically, and this can help round out a lot of deficiencies that most people are walking around with, and that means healthier shoulders, bigger benches, and so on. And it also makes you look better. It adds a lot to your physique. These just aren't doing a whole hell of a lot by themselves, so they go further down the list. These have to be on the back end of a more robust plan. I absolutely love face pulls before a heavy pressing session. Makes my shoulders feel amazing, and it's the little bit of external rotation that I do, but they still have to get a D tier because if all I do is face pulls, I'm not going to get a lot of physicality out of it except for the ability to throw a softball behind me. Rear pec deck flies and bent dumbbell raises are both really good for getting your rhomboids and rear delts built up and hitting the mid part of your traps. I give those a C rating because those stand to make a substantial amount of physical difference if done by themselves. And if you do a good job of pairing it with heavier hitters, well, my friend, it's game over. And then lastly, we have the shrug. Yes, we're putting shrug on upper back day because like I said, we don't want that width and thickness by itself. We also need that back height. We want that 3D back. So if you want those traps to stand tall, you got to do a simple shrug. I'm not going to pick apart all the different shrugs you can do. Barbell to the front, behind the back, dumbbells, highs shrugs are one of my favorites because they're easy to set up. Just get in a calf raise machine, set the pads on your shoulders and go to town. But any type of shoulder elevation under a load for a lot of reps, a lot of effort progress over time is going to give you a beefy pair of Goldberg type traps. I give shrugs a B because these actually will transform your physique quite a bit by itself. You're not going to grow big lats off of them, but people that commit to shrugs where before they did not, they tend to look different after a few months of chipping away. So I am a fan of shrugs. So all in all, isolation gets a solid B rating. I rate it above pull-ups. A lot of people are going to find that to be absolute heresy, but come fight me in the comments. Now, the next question you're going to have is, how do I make sense of this? What do I do with all of this information to actually put together a back program? And I can make an entirely separate video about that. In fact, I probably will. But for now, I recommend you go to the link below and fill out the form, and you are going to get access for my free download. It's going to cover the different ways you can approach upper back training, whether it's on the back end of some other specialized program. If you're a power lifter or a strongman, but you need to supplement upper back work, maybe you are a hypertrophy guy and you want to go through an upper back specialization phase. There's blunt approaches, surgical approaches, there's maintenance approaches, and there are a lot of different progressions you can use. So my free download is going to give you some insight, some special back programs that plug right in to anything else that you happen to be doing. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.